get to know all of you a little bit better since we'll be working together for the next few days. So for starters, got a little bit crushed, but I brought some chocolate from Brazil. It's actually hazelnut. I meant to get something more sort of tropical, but anyway, I'll open it so no one will feel inhibited, but please help yourselves.
Thank you.
Take more than one. I'm getting fat. I don't want to eat it. It's for you guys. So okay, let's just very quickly kind of go around the room, and maybe each of you could tell me your name and what kind of things you're working on. I don't want to spend too much time with it, but just to get oriented a little bit, and then I can tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll get started. I think you need to shift over for our. I never imagined I would be filmed while teaching about film.
That's a postmodern, you know?
It's very postmodern.
Yeah.
If I take a selfie while we do it, then the circle is. Okay.
Hello.
Would you like to begin?
Yes.
Sure.
My name is Young-Ah.
Okay.
That's my Korean name. I don't have an English name, but you can call me Sonia if you want. I don't mind.
Would you like me to call you Sonia?
Yeah.
Okay, then I will.
I am in PhD course and studying about cinema is my first time. It's very interesting and a lot to know, that a lot that I didn't know. I'm finding out what I didn't know, and that's all.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Soyeon Kim. I am from Women's University. I'm probably not on the list.
You are.
I am? Oh, okay. Yeah. I am in the PhD program at the English Language and Literature program at Women's University. I don't know if you know what that is.
I was invited to give I was part of like a conference there about 3 years ago.
3 years ago? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so I wrote my MA thesis on film.
Okay.
And right now I'm in pursuit of studying sort of East Asian or Korean American cinema.
My name is Sujin, and this is my first year as an MA student. My major is rhetoric, and since I'm just beginning, everything is sort of new to me.
Okay.
I'm happy to absorb everything I can when you're here.
Well,
Hi, my name is Sil Kim. I'm in my PhD program in rhetoric/English writing.
okay.
So, yeah, this is my first semester too. Well, I wrote my MA on like more of like a linguistic field.
Okay.
So I'm just still figuring out like what I can do in English literature program. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Shay Kim. I just graduated from Asian Studies here at Yonsei last February, and I am beginning my master's in actually Korean literature, pre-modern,
Okay.
and I'm hoping to look at some 18th, 19th century travel journals.
Okay, great.
My name is Seiyun. I am studying English literature and I'm a third semester student. And I actually don't know much about Japanese and Brazilian culture, but I hope to learn a lot.
Okay.
I'm Isaku. I'm a post-colonial scholar, maybe expanding my research interests to Asian cinema and culture.
What did you do your PhD at?
Bloomington, India.
What did you do it on?
Oh,
when you were there?
19th century, 20th century novel, English novel,
Oh,
British.
Okay. So I also started from that as an undergraduate. I was an English major, so like some of you. I did my PhD, my MA and my PhD in modern Japanese literature. And my first book was a translation of the sort of detective and mystery fiction writer Edogawa Rampo. available for purchase on Amazon. My second book, which came out end of 2015, is about the relationship of literature and media in late 19th, early 20th century, that is to say Meiji era Japan. So that was what I was focused on for a long time, sort of media history and media theory. When I finished my PhD at Cornell, I started a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard before I took my first job. And I was living right next door to Cambridge, which is where Harvard is located, in a town called Somerville, which has a very large Brazilian immigrant population. Also a lot of Portuguese immigrants. And it was there that I really became interested for the first time in Brazil. And sort of independent of anything to do with Japan, I decided to go to Brazil and to learn Portuguese, and I spent a lot of time in Rio de Janeiro, which has really no Asian population. Now it's growing like a very little bit, but it was always with the idea in mind of coming back to the question of Japanese immigration. So I had learned very early on when I started to get interested in Brazil that, I should point out, this was in 2006-07, okay? 2008 was the centenary of the Japanese immigration to Brazil. So we're now, several years, almost a decade past that 100th year benchmark, right? So it's quite impressive if you think about it that we have over 100 years of history between Japan and Brazil. I have some slides I'll show you in a moment that give you sort of the numbers of the pre-war immigration. This film, right, is set in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Right? It is a dramatization that takes a lot of liberties with history, but the essence of the film, the sort of emotional truth of the film, I think is fair, is helpful for us to get a sense of the kind of changes that took place. I'll provide some of the background. So just to finish sort of describing myself, my own research interests, I became interested in the Japanese immigration, but primarily in the first half, that is to say the pre-war era. So the current book that I'm working on is focused on the period from 1908 until 1941, when the Japanese newspapers were banned and Japanese language was prohibited. There was some precedent a few years earlier, but 1941, with the onset of following Pearl Harbor, the onset of sort of aggression, declaration of war against Japan by Brazil meant that the situation would sort of irrevocably change. So that being said, I'm not much of a war historian. I'm much more interested in the things before. But this course that we're going to be doing the next 3 days is really looking at the post-war situation. So, I will, in this PowerPoint presentation, that it's not going to take very long, but that I prepared for today, tries to talk at least a little bit about things in the pre-war period, so that we can, we have to understand what came before, so that we can then understand what follows. And I think that it'll be helpful for those of you who are interested in Asian American literature, film, and so forth, especially in the North American context, to have Brazil as a comparative basis, because there are similarities, but there are also some very profound differences. Okay? Okay, so there are any number of ways to start. Let me just say a few things. I, as a graduate student, had been trained in film studies, film analysis. I'm not going to focus too much on those aspects today. We will do kind of you're welcome to do it, of course. My focus is going to be in part a close reading of the narrative of these texts, but also thinking about historical contexts as well. So we have 3 very different films, as well as supplementary readings. The first film is, an action drama of sorts. We'll talk about what kind of film it is. I think it's not as obvious as we might think, and when we start to consider the question of genre, we really can open up a lot of discussion. Okay, but at least in principle, this is a film that takes the historical moment of the end of the war as its focus. And of course, these are actors, right? I mean, that much is beyond dispute. The second that I wanted to show, which we'll actually do third, the film called Lonely Swallows, is a documentary. Right? So we have a cast of mostly young, so-called Yonsei, or 4th generation Japanese Brazilians. Okay, I'm not exactly sure how old like their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were, so some of them, in theory, could have had family members that went back to the pre-war period. But there was a resumption after World War II ended. There was a resumption of Japanese immigration from, I think, the 50s into, let's say, about 1970s. At a certain point, the Japanese economy was strong, and really people just didn't want to emigrate. But it's conceivable that someone who's, let's say, great-grandparents emigrated in the 1950s, they have children very young in life, they could, you can get to 4th generation that way too. The point is, we will see a very different portrait of the relationship between Japan and Brazil, looking at this early 21st century example. Right? And then the other one, the last film, which we're going to actually wind up doing tomorrow, City of Lost Souls, is kind of a parody of martial arts and Yakuza films and other forms of sort of hard-boiled genre fiction. With this one, too, we also have to talk a lot about questions of genre. But the protagonist is actually, although he's supposed to be like Afro-Nipo-Brazilian, he's actually a native speaker of Spanish, and his Portuguese is really weird. So we have a portrayal of the Nikkei, particularly Brazilian community in Japan. This is 2001, I think the film came out, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it is sort of a late 20th century, representation of the so-called dekasegi, or temporary workers, and their community in Japan, amidst other portrayals of Chinese, and I don't remember if they're Koreans in the film. I have to go back and watch it tonight. But there are a lot of other foreigners in Japan who make an appearance, and I think we'll find it interesting to problematize sort of what's wrong with this film. There are moments I'm sure you're going to laugh, and I'm sure it's a fun movie to watch, but in many ways it trades on stereotypes. And so this was not our original first choice. Originally, Dr. Ria and I had talked about a film called Sodaji, which was made, I think, in 2011. But even when a friend of a friend contacted the director directly, he sort of has distanced himself from his work. And there's no DVD, and we couldn't get print of the film, so we just sort of, this was plan B. Okay, and then lastly, it's interesting to note, the Dirty Hearts film is actually a film by a Brazilian director, right? And then City of Lost Souls by Miike Takashi is kind of like horror, genre film director. And then I'm forgetting the name of the third person, but it's obviously a kind of amateur documentary type of production. So again, at least in terms of our discussion of film, these are all three fairly recent works, but they're very different genres, very different styles of filmmaking. So that'll be something that we'll be inevitably talking about quite a bit. Okay. Let me turn to the PowerPoint. Find my cursor. Okay. So let's look at this together. This is a statement actually taken from a book in Portuguese that I translated, but almost certainly had been originally articulated in Japanese. After all, this was coming from Japan's plenipotentiary minister. This is sort of prior to the establishment of this formal immigration relationship with Brazil in 1906. Prohibited from entering Australia, discriminated against in the United States, persecuted in Canada, and limited even from entering Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, our workers will find in the state of Sao Paulo a rare felicity, a veritable paradise. Now, for those of you who study Asian American, particularly United States-based Asian American literature, 1906, 1907, these are very important dates. Why is that? Does anyone want to take a guess? Well, Pearl Harbor is a little bit later. That's like 1941. No. You would be hard-pressed to find a good airplane in 1906. The Japanese immigration, which had begun in the late 19th century, first to Hawaii and then to the west coast of both the United States and Canada, was very strongly reacted to. That's not the best English way. There was a great deal of concern on the part of the fairly recently arrived white Americans that there were this sort of Asian invasion of Chinese and Japanese workers. Right? And so in response to, first there was the earthquake in San Francisco that devastated much of the city, and following that, under the sort of emergency measures that emerged, there had been discriminatory policies. In fact, if memory serves correctly, it was something like the school board wanted to group Japanese, Chinese, and Korean children together, segregated from white children. And the Japanese government was very conscious of not being lumped in with people who they regarded as their colonial subjects. Japan also wanted to maintain a good relationship with the United States. So what happens is, in 1907, we have what's called the Gentleman's Agreement, right? That the United States and Japan make a deal. Rather than have formal discriminatory legislation against Japanese immigration, Japan would voluntarily stop sending their workers, their people, to the United States. And of course, the people who were already there could remain, and there were still some coming in, sometimes sort of through the back door. They would come to Hawaii or they'd come to Canada. But Canada, too, forms its own gentleman's agreement. And Australia, even earlier, 1901, 1902, I'm terrible with memorizing dates, but it's easy to look up. Australia actually had enacted what was called the White Australia Policy, okay, to keep Asian immigrants out. So Australia was actually first. It's not just alphabetically first in this list. Each of those Anglophone countries had done their best to prohibit Japanese immigration in some form. Okay, so Japan which was an expanding nation state and empire. Right? We also know 1906 is after the Russo-Japanese War, so Japan's relationship to Korea, right, is also on a very different path. Japan was looking to send what they considered, although they often wouldn't call it this officially, its surplus population to other places, right, to alleviate poverty and potential unrest in mostly regional areas, the hinterlands. But also, working outside of Japan was more profitable. Working in the fields, sugarcane in Hawaii, working in California, washing dishes in someone's house, going ultimately to Brazil and growing coffee. You could make a better living than you could back home in Japan. And you would be better fed as well. You weren't going to go hungry. As we'll see also, you didn't have to worry about military conscription. So your sons don't go off and get killed in a war. Okay? But this early statement not only underscores the discrimination that Japanese immigrants faced, primarily in the Anglophone world, but also anticipates that 1908 beginning of Japanese immigration to Brazil. So the groundwork had already been laid earlier. It didn't just sort of magically, spontaneously happen. Now, one of the other very important things that we have to understand about the pre-war context is that it was like a state-to-state relationship. The Japanese government and the Brazilian government, and sometimes like the state of Sao Paulo and certain prefectures in Japan would work together to bring these workers over to Brazil. And the idea was that unlike in other contexts like Hawaii and California, they were not simply going to work for a short period of time, make some money, more money than they would have made in Japan, and then come home, but that they would stay in Brazil. Okay? And they would emigrate under Brazilian, the Brazilian government mandated that they emigrate as families to further establish a stable community, basically a stable labor population. Now the Japanese were by no means the only immigrants going to Sao Paulo or elsewhere in Brazil. The largest number of people were coming from Italy, okay, but from Germany, from other parts of Southern Europe. And the Brazilian, particularly coffee planter class, wanted to swamp the labor pool. They wanted to have lots of cheap labor. Right? Because if you have very few laborers, they're expensive, and they can demand more from you. Okay? In the history of Japanese immigration, therefore, to North America versus South America, it's very important, even the difference between Brazil and Peru. Peru being on the Pacific coast, right, it was much easier for people to get to. And indeed, they started coming in the late 19th century. But they would come sort of on their own. Right? Even to Korea, there would be Japanese, sort of poor Japanese people looking for work, and they would just cross, right, take the ferry and cross to the peninsula and start working. They didn't care what the government was doing. They weren't waiting for permission, not to starve to death. So they would just come, and that's also a very interesting part of the story, because when the Japanese empire finally takes control of Korea, there's already this population of sort of lower class, working class people, and the two sides don't necessarily get along, right? There's some conflict, even amongst the Japanese who were here in Korea. So, one of the other things we have to take into account is the tremendous distance involved in getting to Brazil. Right? It took about 50 days on a steamship, and you would go from Kobe. I was just there a few days ago. I went to the Immigration Museum, so some of the slides you'll see are from there. Everyone would assemble in Kobe. They would have to go through quarantine to be, have a medical check and the like, and they would leave on these steamships that would carry maybe 1,000 people, 700 to 1,000 people. They would go from Kobe to Hong Kong to Singapore to Colombo to Saigon and then to Durban or Cape Town in South Africa, and then cross the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro or the port of Santos, which would bring them into Sao Paulo. Okay? And once they got to the city of Sao Paulo, there was also kind of like quarters for them to be quarantined and separated, and then they would be shipped off to wherever they were going to go to work. So it was a tremendous amount of state-to-state planning. As time goes on, some of these duties are put onto private companies or private landholders. But the life of the Japanese workers when they first come to Brazil is extremely hard. They're treated very badly. And the first batch of people in 1908, 1909, they basically just run away from the coffee plantations because they're being treated like slaves. This happens with other immigrants too. And what we see happen is really around from about the 1920s, that the Japanese government arranges for very wealthy capitalists to buy these coffee plantations, which they call colonies. This is something we'll come back to. The question of terminology and the meaning behind the terms is very important. But we start to see Japanese colonies that are more self-governed, that are more autonomous. Okay? And this is one of the things that makes the difference between the success of the Japanese immigrant experience in Brazil and the not-so-successful experiences elsewhere. The winner-take-all system sometimes happens in Brazil. In fact, much of the literature that I'm studying focuses on the losers, the people who come and they expect to get rich. There's like, gold falling off the trees kind of thing, and then they come and they just get wiped out. But for the most part, it was very successful precisely because the Japanese came over as families. They were treated with respect by the Brazilian government, and they were also given opportunities to accumulate wealth. I mean, this was sort of everyone's dream, to own their own land. Right? If you're the second or third or fifth son of a Hiroshima farmer, what land is there at home for you? They don't cut it up. The first, right, the oldest son, this is probably the same in Korea, right? The oldest son gets everything, and then everybody else has to go somewhere else. So those were some of the conditions that helped contribute to the success of the Japanese immigration. Okay, and it's important to keep that in mind, because what we'll see happen with our first film, where there's repression against the Japanese, right? It wasn't always that way. For the most part, for much of the period from 1908 to 1941, let's say 1938 at least, when things start to worsen, but for much of that period, the Japanese colonies in Brazil were mostly left alone. They could speak Japanese, they could publish their own immigrant newspapers in a language no one else in the country could read. They were allowed to educate their children as they liked, and as long as they were working and making money for other people, right, in a way that was profitable for Brazil, everything was fine. Okay? Now the relationship between Japan and Brazil will change dramatically in the second and the third films as well. Because in post-war era, once Japan has recovered and is set on this trajectory of becoming, like information society and post-industrial power, although it's still producing a lot of manufacturing, right? There was a tremendous need for people to work in the factories. Okay, we'll see described in actually some of the readings, even for today, the so-called 3 or Sankei work, which in Japanese stands for kiken, kitsui, and kitanai. Or in English, it's more like the 3 Ds. Dirty, dangerous, and what was the third? Difficult. That's right. So jobs that no one else wants to do, they bring in foreign labor. But Japan didn't want to alter the sort of chemistry of what had become the homogeneous post-war Japanese nation state. Right? Loss of total unconditional defeat in World War II, the complete loss of its empire. Right? Japan even loses Okinawa to the American military, right, until 1970s. So when they decided they needed to bring people in to do these jobs, they turned to these people who we now call Nikkei. Right? Nikkei Brazilians, Nikkei Peruvians. One of the things I really want to do today, one of the main foci for today, is to problematize and historicize this term Nikkei. Okay? Because we don't see that word at all in the pre-war. At least, you know, it meant something completely different. Like the Japanese division of such and such army in China, right? As opposed to the Manchurian or the Chinese faction. But it did not mean something like people of Japanese descent born elsewhere. That is a unique legacy of the post-war period, and I think what this first film does best is show us the historical rupture or break when that identity first emerges. Okay, it emerges in Brazil, it emerges in the United States. There are some very important differences. Okay. But you don't have a concept of Nikkei in the pre-war period. We'll come back to that. Let's look at some pictures. So these are from what is now called the Kobe Center for Overseas Immigration and Cultural Interaction. It's quite a mouthful. It used to be called something more like the Kobe Center for, what was it, like in Japanese it's called Shuyojo, which is like the same word we use for like concentration camp or internment camp. It's a very surprising and somewhat unintentional resonance, but worth thinking about. So this one in particular is probably the most iconic poster. It's a little hard to see here, but you have this shirtless man holding a hoe. This was sort of the symbol of the Japanese immigrants, the enxada, as it's called in Portuguese. And tucked under his arm is like the family, almost like dolls. Sorry this is a little bit blurry, but he's pointing to Brazil, right, here set off in like white. So people who've never heard of this place and don't know where it is, right, there it is on the map. Again, this reproduction is a bit too small. I have another better image I can show you guys that shows Peru is also listed here. So sort of the two biggest countries in South America for Japanese immigration. And it says in Japanese, like, okay then, gather your family and head to South America. Okay. These other posters too talk about a new paradise, Shintenshi in Japanese, in Brazil, or you know the treasure, sort of the treasure of this green, you know, vast land. So Brazil was marketed to these laborers as sort of the answer to all their problems. You go there, there's endless land, a tropical climate where everything grows, and you have this tremendous cash crop, which of course is coffee. This one is also from the Immigration Center, and although it's too small, I can, again, provide you guys with a better, larger visualization of the image so you can actually see the numbers. The numbers, for our purposes, are not terribly important, but just to show, you know, that, as you can see here, black is like the highest, and then this sort of reddish is the next, you know, and obviously the white is like the smallest number of people sent. Okinawa, of course, is down here. Actually, was the largest, had over 100,000 immigrants who went to Brazil. Hiroshima Prefecture, another poor, less industrially developed parts of Kyushu. Interestingly, though, although it's not one of the ones in black, Hokkaido sent something like 26,000 people to Brazil. Right? And that's quite impressive, both in terms of Hokkaido being by far the newest of the islands of Japan. Right? Until 1870, it wasn't called Hokkaido and it wasn't part of Japan. Right? So that was really, in many ways, the first frontier of the expanding Japanese state. It's a really fascinating history we won't get into today. I'd be happy to talk about it some other time if you're kind of history nerds. But the important thing is also, of course, that Hokkaido is a very different climate. So people who had been willing to brave the cold were now willing to brave the tropical heat. And many of the stories that I look at from the pre-war period, almost none of them talk about Okinawa. I suspect that the literacy rates and cultural differences were such that the Okinawans didn't participate as much in the literary culture, but people from Hokkaido mostly had come from the lower ranks of the samurai class. It was sort of the place they were supposed to go to start a new life, and that didn't work out so well. So many of them, 26,000 in the pre-war period, headed to Brazil. The numbers are approximate, I should say, because those charts actually have the post-war immigration as well. This is the numbers for Brazil broken down by like 5-year increments, which hopefully gives you a pretty good idea. Up to 1941, I believe the number gets up to 188,000 and change. But you can see here there were very small numbers at first, but by the time we get into the mid-1920s, right, through the mid-1930s, the numbers sort of explode. So that really by 1941, 42, even if we want to think about 1945, 46, when this film, Dirty Hearts, is set, we have a very substantial population, most of whom are either first or second generation, Issei, Nisei, as we call them in Japanese. Okay. And with that expansion, of course, you have newspapers, you have radio, you have all kinds of sort of infrastructure for sustaining Japanese identity so far from home. I'll try to fill in some of the blanks as we go further along into the discussion of the film. There's a lot to learn. We'll try to do it slowly, but again, you really have to understand some of the deeper history of the pre-war period to understand what happens afterward. It's not just, well, they used to speak Japanese and now they speak Portuguese. That's a very big consequence. They used to identify more with Japan, now they identify more with Brazil. Anyone could tell you that, but it takes a little bit more depth of knowledge to really understand what lies behind those very big changes. Okay, so when I went to that Kobe Immigration Museum, I didn't even know this existed, but there's this magazine called Brasil. It's the katakana there. And if you look at the subtitles, again, I'm sorry it's a bit fuzzy, it actually says in Japanese, Ishokumin to Boeki, so it's immigration and commerce. This term, Ishokumin, actually, I've never seen anywhere else. It is the collapsing of two terms. One is imin, meaning immigrants, immigration, and the other is shokumin, or colonial. Right? Shokuminji would be colonial territory. Shokumin would be colonial people. Right? So it's like colonial immigrants. Now, in Portuguese, they use the term colonia, like colony in English. And what it doesn't have the implication of colonization by military force or anything that we might associate, but simply a population of immigrants living more or less not in utter isolation. Nobody lives in total isolation, but more or less having their own settlement where they could speak their own language, eat their own food, etc., etc. And even in the United States, for instance, in Florida, in Boca Raton, which is now mostly like old retired Jewish and Italian folks, there was a Japanese community that had been invited in the early 1901, 1902, something like that, early 20th century, to grow pineapple. And they were like out-competed by Cuban pineapple growers, and it didn't succeed. But even to this day, there's Yamato Road running through this part of Florida. Of course, nobody in Florida knows what Yamato is. You guys, right? Yamato is one of those terms for Japan, the sort of oldest Japanese state, going back to antiquity. So, colony or colonia in the Portuguese context doesn't mean something militarist, doesn't mean something imperialist, but it does have a lot of resonances with pioneering and development and other sort of ideas about sort of opening the frontier. Now in Japan, in Japanese, they use the same term, this term shokuminchi, in the Brazilian context. It's the same term that they would use for Korea, for Taiwan, for parts of China and Manchuria. The same rhetoric of opening the frontier and development and the like were used. And you can kind of see some of these images, like the farmer here sort of turning the forest. If I could just step over here. Right? We have this sort of tropical forest. I don't know if I can push that out of the way. Right? You have these little figures here cutting down lumber and clearing land. This is what we call like slash and burn agriculture. Here we have coffee plantations. Right? This is Rio de Janeiro. Do you guys recognize what this is?
Sculpture?
Right, the Christ statue would be there, but this is before it was put up there. This is the Corcovado, the Hunchback Mountain. Right, we have a kind of iconic, what the Brazilians like to call like a picture postcard image of Rio. And of course it's quite shocking to us because we were accustomed to seeing the Christ statue, Christ the Redeemer at the top of the mountain. Okay, so aside from this one, the other covers are kind of useful in visualizing the kind of labor that the Japanese were going there to do. Right? These were surprisingly educated people. I mean, part of my project is to try to overturn some of these ideas that these were just, simple farmers or, illiterate people or something. They actually wrote a great deal. And even these sort of trade journal magazines had literature. Maybe not great literature, but they have literature in them. The immigrant newspapers are full of amateur literature. In other words, people who are living in the community, they might be a bank clerk or a dentist as opposed to, say, a coffee plantation laborer, but they were writing to the newspapers, submitting their stories and the like. And the sophistication of knowledge about agriculture, about world politics, the things you see in those newspapers is very, very surprising. So, the visibility and the importance of Brazil to the Japanese Empire in the pre-war period, I think, has not been adequately covered in, academia, not in Japanese language scholarship, not in English, and not in Portuguese. So this is really something that, again, with 100 plus 110 years of history, a lot of younger scholars are starting to get interested in. I have several grad students who I've gotten to meet, one at UCLA, one was at Kobe University, I think that's the name of the university, who are working in Argentina. So people are starting to rediscover this stuff, to find the archive. And it's tough. I mean, it's just hard finding these things. I've had to go to Kobe, to Tokyo, to Sao Paulo, you know, and really look. It's not like there's just a, you know, Norton edition, something like that. Okay. This is also from one of those Brazil trade magazines. This was a page just to show you the complexity. These are the train routes that had, by 1927, been developed in what is otherwise a fairly underdeveloped country. It wasn't enough to just get labor into the hinterlands, the interior of Sao Paulo and other places, which turned out to be sort of ideal for growing coffee, the best quality of coffee at that. You also had to get the coffee out of there, right? And the same ships that are bringing, you know, human beings from one end of the world to the other are taking that coffee and also transporting it around the world as well. So we have the movement of labor, right, and what do you want to call it, like cash crops, commodities, and so forth. Okay. These are things that we won't see in the three films. These three films portray sort of the human drama aspect. But nobody got to Brazil so that they could just plant, you know, a Hinomaru Japanese flag and become a, you know, a patriot in a foreign land. This is what brought them. Right? This was the main thing. Yeah.
The farm portrayed in Dairy House was a cotton.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I think even if we go back, I think, which one was it? This could be. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is coffee, right? These look like they're plucking the cherries from coffee, but certainly cotton, rice, all kinds of other products were also being grown. The important thing is that coffee was like far and away the most profitable, and it was the reason, right? The raison d'être, the reason for being there, literally. Right? Now, again, the Japanese immigrants were not stupid, and they weren't going there to be exploited. They were going there to try to establish themselves on their own footing. So what would oftentimes happen is they would see a piece of land that was just forest. You know, it's not a jungle. Sao Paulo is not the Amazon, right? Brazil is a vast continent. Sao Paulo is actually fairly moderate climate. You need that like perfect soil and climate to grow coffee, but there are places that were not good for coffee for different reasons. And very often the Japanese would say to their Brazilian, you know, sort of non-Japanese, you know, Brazilian, you know, fellow citizens, sell me that piece of land. And they would say, yeah, sure, of course. We don't want it, we can't use it. And so Brazil, which had been importing rice, very quickly became an exporter of rice. And even to this day, if you go to Brazil, you find all kinds of fruits that the Japanese domesticated and popularized. So the tangerines, like mikan. The Japanese developed a tropical version of persimmons, which look like tomatoes. And even to this day, I sometimes, like, I'll go to, like, breakfast and I'll grab what I think is, like, a tomato, and it turns out to be very sweet. And they're very, like, reddish. To, you know, they really use a lot of agricultural, you know, botanical science. I like to think of this as, I'm not sure if Louise Young in her book uses, but the term agrarian modernity. We're so used to thinking about modernity as something that happens in cities, happens in factories and in industrial development. But the countryside is also a place of modernity. In fact, if I can just, let me just, I think that's almost the last one. I have a picture of the map. I'll show you guys maybe tomorrow. The map that takes you across this great route across the world. In a certain way, the sort of global, postmodern mixing and remixing of cultures and genres and tropes in the film City of Lost Souls does get a certain, has a certain kind of precedent in this transnational movement. Because if we look at the Japanese immigrants who go from Kobe to Hong Kong, Singapore, right? What's so paradoxical about this is that you have people who mostly come from the interior of rural, poor, underdeveloped parts of Japan, and then they come to these rural, relatively poor, underdeveloped parts of Brazil. But to get from point A to point B, they see the entire world and are exposed to a lot of places, a lot of things. They see more of the world than most of us ever will. We get on a plane and we just, watch a bunch of movies and we get off a few hours later, I don't know where we are. They actually had to go through that experience the slow, painstaking way. Okay, let me show you one other sort of longish quote, and this will help bring us into this discussion of the key terms that this film presents. And if you need, we can take a break and then come back and talk about the film. But let's just sort of try to get through this long quote here. So this is by a historian, I believe he's at the University of Pennsylvania. Eiichiro is his first name, Eiichiro Azuma. Okay. And he says, instead of simply creating the infrastructure of imperial rule within Japan proper, the advocates of Japanese expansion argued that the country should embark on a project of real empire building through mass emigration, international trade, and, if necessary, proactive military deployment. Because the emigration of rural people to Hawaii and the American West had just begun in the mid-1880s, nationalists willingly mistook the popular practice of temporary work abroad, or dekasegi, for the first instance of Japanese colonialist expansion in the modern era. Founded by the hardliners in 1893, the Colonization Society, or Shokumin Kyokai, reified such conceptual confusions because its members equated state-supported colonialist ventures in Asia and the Pacific with mass labor migration to the Americas. While calling for an imperialist war, such pundits expressed a desire to see more and more subjects of their quote-unquote expansive nation migrating abroad for the quote-unquote conquest of frontiers and the building of quote-unquote new Japans beyond Japanese shores. So Azuma here is talking about the late 19th century. He's not talking about Brazil, right? Brazil starts in 1908. But from the outset, right, we're still in Meiji, which I like to think I know something about, just spending a lot of years studying it. We're still in the Meiji period, and this is, 1890s, right? We haven't even gotten to the Russo-Japanese War yet. But as a consequence of the first Sino-Japanese War, Taiwan becomes the fifth island of Japan, right? Hokkaido is number 4, Taiwan is number 5. People are already going in search of labor opportunities. Well, no one likes working, everyone likes making money. They're in search of a better life, right? People are going in search of money, in search of good work opportunities in Hawaii. Some people are even leaving for Peru, right? They're not following some state-to-state model, they're just doing this opportunistically. But the ideologues look at this dekasegi phenomenon, right? And they sort of deliberately distort or misunderstand it for their own purposes as the first instance of Japanese colonialist expansion. Okay. And again, if we look up here, a project of empire building through mass immigration, international trade, will stop. Military deployment doesn't happen. Let me assure you that in Brazil, as in the American West, people were, terrified of the so-called Yellow Peril, that there was going to be this invasion by the Japanese Empire, right? That these immigrants were going to be the advanced guard for what would become a takeover of the white race by the yellow race. Okay, not everybody thought this, but enough people thought this way that it shapes national politics. Okay, I study one of these ideologues of expansion very closely. He was extremely charismatic. He was fluent in English. He wrote for both an English and a Japanese audience. He would his name was Tsurumi Yusuke. His son, Tsurumi Shunsuke, became a pacifist historian in the post-war period. But the father, would write things like, to an American audience, he would say, "We have never sent so-called surplus population to places where they're not wanted. If the Americans don't want us, we won't go there." And actually, in the United States in 1924, they passed what's popularly known as the Alien Exclusion Act, which proved to Japan that the gentleman's agreement was not signed with gentlemen, because they didn't keep their promise. They actually made legislation against the Japanese. Okay, so just to bring this back to the film and then the contemporary era and so forth, this idea of temporary labor abroad, dekasegi, was something that had already existed even before it went overseas. These people from the poor, mostly farming communities, usually during the winter months when they couldn't farm, would go to other places, cities, what have you, where they could find work to make money, and then they would come home to farm. So dekasegi was the template. It was the original model that you would go. If you had to leave the country, so be it. You go where the work is, you make money, and then you come home. Nobody wanted necessarily to give up being, I should say no one, but the idea was that loyal citizens of the Japanese Empire should not be throwing away their Japanese citizenship. This is a very important, it's in fact the critical point of the film. We'll come back to talking about it. Okay? But dekasegi is one key term, and then this confusion or conflation, collapsing of immigration and colonization. This is something that we have to be absolutely clear about, or else nothing that happens in the film is going to make any sense. It's also why when you watch the film with subtitles and you don't have a clear explanation of what's happening in Japanese, you also kind of lose that thread, because the terminology is so important. Okay, so Azuma is not talking about Japan, not talking about Brazil at all. This is all sort of 1893, end of the 19th century. But we can see here already the formation of this discourse, where immigration is going to be a central pillar of Japanese expansionism. So I'm just going to use the board for a second. Apologies to the people watching at home. Right? My argument is that sorry, this is a little bit faint. Expansionism is the bigger term. All right, I'm going to have to switch to red. Sorry. You have imperialism, and of course you have militarism as well. But on the other side, you have immigration and trade. Okay? And it's not precise. These are working definitions, if you will. But there were two strategies in the Japanese Empire. One was called the Northern Advanced Doctrine, Hokushinron, and then you had a Southern Advanced Doctrine, Nanshinron. And when we get into World War II, they both turn into military conquest and colonization. But for much of the late 19th and early 20th century, the strategy with respect to Japan's southern neighbors, they take over Micronesia. Some Japanese soldiers basically show up on a boat and plant the flag and say, "Welcome to the Japanese Empire." It's all peacefully done with the threat of violence behind it. But immigration and trade is the main thing. Okay. And again, the Japanese had to go through all those ports. Saigon was French, but the rest of them were mostly British-controlled ports of call. So you really need to have friends. You need to have people who are cooperative in order to make the money. Okay? So let me, I think that's maybe the last slide. Yeah. Let me stop here. We'll take a short break and then we'll pick up with the film. The last point. Although surplus population was a very important issue, the other thing we have to remember is remittances. Does everyone know what remittances are? Yeah, like sending money, you know, in the United States, Western Union was like the main way of doing it. The hard currency that was being sent home to Japan was incredibly important to Japan after the Russo-Japanese War, around the era of the Great Depression, right, etc. So you had people going abroad, earning, relatively speaking, high wages, sending money home. This becomes incredibly important. It's important everywhere, even today. Okay, if you look at the question of Mexican immigration to the United States, right, sort of de facto or so-called illegal immigration, the question of remittances is a huge deal to both countries. The question of, we'll see with the Lonely Swallows film and the readings that I assigned to go with it, the remittances and the economic power of this Nikkei Brazilian community in Japan, also tremendously important. They don't realize it at first, but like sort of gradually in the late 90s, early 2000s, before 2008, when everything changes. The Lonely Swallows film takes place right around that time, right around the time that the so-called Great Recession, or in Japan they call it the Lehman Shock, after the collapse of the company Lehman Brothers, you know, big Wall Street firm, changes everything. So the question of remittances, it's not just that Japan is trying to, you know, get rid of people or they need to send them somewhere else. It's also a question of, you know, capitalism. There's a very important component there too. Okay, so let's take a break for what, 5 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. I'm not going anywhere. All right, so take a break for about 10 minutes, and when we come back, we'll start looking at the film. We'll get into the fun part. So I hope that